Andy, welcome to the Frugal Spender podcast. How are you?
Really good, thanks, and honoured, as always honoured to do these sorts of things. And I love the name of your podcast, genuinely, Frugal Spender.
Thank you.
That's very aligned with. So my second book's called Live on Less, Invest the Rest. So that seems to be fairly
Absolutely.
aligned.
Well, I kind of, I've said this a few times before in the podcast, but I feel like I've kind of messed up a little bit because I love the idea of having sort of two sides to the coin, literally, frugal and spending. So you have to find that balance. But quite often people forget about the spending bit and people just assume that I'm locked away in my house, squirreling away everything and never spending any money. So
eating Tesco value baked beans.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm just known as frugal and not as a spender. So
well, that was if I make one of the things I say. I can't remember which of my books I say is like because one of our big sort of ideas is that everyone should be investing at least 10% of what they earn each month. And, you know, a lot of people are like, how am I possibly going to do that? And to the spending point rather than the frugal point, one of the sort of psychological reframes you can do, which sounds a bit ridiculous, but actually works, like a lot of reframing does, is rather than say, how do I save and invest 10% of my income every month? You say, you sit down on a rainy Sunday afternoon and say, how do I spend 90% of what I earn optimally to make me happy? Yes. And weirdly enough, that actually works because then by focusing on the positive side and spending then you work out in quite a serious way, like what do I actually want to spend my money on and what shouldn't I be spending? If you do it that way round, you often find that you actually have 10% left over for investment.
Totally. That's why I almost am against when people call budgeting a spending plan, but I can see why they do it because it is that kind of budgeting feels restrictive, even though you're doing the exact same thing. You're literally just allocating your funds, your resources to wherever you actually want to put it. Whereas a spending plan makes you feel like, oh, I'm actually allowed to do it, even though exactly the same thing. But like you said, just a slight reframe actually makes me feel good about it.
Well, the example after news is there's this example from sort of psychology, which is called the surgery example to show how powerful reframing is truly, because people kind of they roll their eyes at you and go, really, like you think I'm going to have a higher percentage chance of saving money if I work out how to spend? I mean, surely it's the two sides of the same coin. But the surgery example is a really good one, which shows how powerful reframing actually is, which is basically, imagine if you need an operation for some sort of serious illness, which has a 90% chance of you surviving, but a 10% chance of you dying, like under the knife during the surgery. It's like a risky procedure. And it empirically evidenced is the fact that if the doctor sits across the table from somebody and says, we need to operate, in order to resolve this medical issue you have, and if we do, there's a 90% chance it'll all be fine and you'll survive and you'll have a great medical outcome. Most people say, okay, well, let's go ahead. But if they say, if we operate and do this operation, there's a 10% chance you'll die, by the way, just need to tell you. Hardly anybody wants the operation, even though probabilistically they're exactly the same. And that's like a really powerful example of one of many cognitive biases our brains have, that like we are not logical animals at all, as much as like, and actually that's hugely relevant to investment and investment success for all sorts of reasons I'm sure we can come on to.
Oh, absolutely. But before we go any further, we've really touched on some awesome stuff, and you've alluded to the fact that you are an author and you've written books. But for somebody who has lived under a rock and hasn't seen your books and consumed any of your content, would you mind just giving a very brief overview of who you are and what's led you to coming onto this podcast?
So I'll do my best. So I always joke that firstly, that's the question that British people hate the most. It's like, would you mind to? Actually, yes, because I'm British and I don't really want to talk about myself. But then, ironically, my wife will tell you that every time I do one of these podcasts, she's like, "It took you 15 minutes to talk about it, so try and do it in 3 instead of." But I mean, look, basically, I was sort of what my grandmother would have described as kind of like a rogue trader. Which I wasn't at all. That was just my grandmother not understanding what I did. But I did economics and politics at uni, I guess in the early 90s or mid 90s. Actually, I was very lucky. My first job, sort of the day after I finished my finals, which at the time I was very annoyed about because all my mates were going to Ibiza for the summer or the Greek islands or whatever, and I had a suitcase full of suits and I was going to Washington DC. But which all end up being quite a good thing to do because I got an internship in the US Congress in the US equivalent of Westminster, which was an amazing way to spend your first kind of summer after uni. Because basically it just meant that when I applied for all the jobs that I was interested in doing, when I came back to the UK at the end of that summer, you got interviews because they were like,
bet.
what the hell's this thing you've done? And it was also an amazing experience, like, wandering around the Pentagon and watching Mars landings and hearing like African American congressmen who marched alongside Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement, actually meeting them and speak to them. It was amazing, right? But I came back and started, as I say, as an evil rogue trader, as basically a plain vanilla stockbroker at what was then SBC Warburg, Swiss bank, in the late 90s. And the journey was really, up to this point, 25 years of being focused on smaller companies. And we can perhaps come on to why that's relevant. And it's, there's a huge part of what I'm talking about at the moment is how challenged the British economy is. And, that's terrible for all of us, and why we have a cost of living crisis. And, life is pretty awful at the moment in the UK. I think everybody has that sense. And a huge part of that, in my opinion, is because we've smashed our smaller company, certainly our stock market listed smaller company ecosystem, which nobody understands, including like 99% of our politicians, quite demonstrably. So that's been my focus, and I'm pretty passionate about that. And then, about 13 years ago, I wrote this book called How to Own the World, which is now in its third edition. And has, happily been one of the top selling personal finance books in the UK for a while. And because of that, my publisher's given me a couple of other book deals in the time since, and I've churned out a couple of others. So like over 13 years, I'm just about to deliver next year, I'm delivering a teenagers and young adults version of my first book, because kind of people have asked for it. And once that's done, no more book projects for a while, because otherwise I will go slightly mad. Basically, and I have this business called Plain English Finance, plainenglishfinance.com, and a growing YouTube channel like everyone else. And like you, we just, I genuinely think that financial literacy is the missing link for so many people's kind of health and happiness. More than 90% of British adults don't have a stocks and shares ISA, which tells you that more than 90% of British adults don't knowingly or proactively invest in stock markets. And that is a massive tragedy for tens of millions of British adults, and more broadly for our society as a whole, because we can't raise capital for businesses to do amazing things now, partly because nobody in Britain is investing. And so that's a sort of personal crusade of mine. There you go. What was that? That was probably about 10 minutes.
Yeah, no, you did a good job. As a good summary. I think you're totally right. That stat that I think it's 7% of people who have a stocks and shares ISA, I think it's worrying, but it's also because I'm now in this world of learning about the stuff and talking about stocks and shares ISA on a daily basis. It's really easy to forget that the vast majority of people don't even know it exists, or if they do, they don't really know what it is. And I think it's hard for me to forget. Even five years ago, I knew a cash ISA existed, I knew a Help to Buy ISA existed, and I just had no idea there was a way of investing in our economy or economies around the world and actually potentially growing my money completely tax-free. That was just, who talks about that? Nobody in the mainstream media talks about
it. How insane is that? Because that's we have such an advantage over so many other countries in the world. Like obviously, sub-Saharan African countries or developing countries, poor countries don't have that. But an awful lot of fairly advanced developed countries don't have that. They have a much more punitive tax regime, and they have because Britain, along with the Dutch, basically invented capital markets, right? We have an incredibly advanced, financial market ecosystem that's really inexpensive and really tax efficient. Let's hope it continues to be, because it's not something we should take for granted, given what various politicians are up to. And to be clear, I'm not being party political there. That both Labour and the Tories have been an absolute disaster for the British economy for the last 30 plus years. And I'm incapable of supporting either political party for that very reason, because I just see so much economic illiteracy. But that's exactly right. People, I describe financial literacy and the considered use of investment as a silver bullet. It's like one of the key vectors for enrichment of individuals. And enrichment's the wrong word, but being comfortably off, right? Like if you don't learn about investment and you don't benefit from compounding, and we always go back to, my argument is that the number one investment theme in history for the last several centuries is human progress. US shares have delivered more than 10% per annum, and I get so many trolls online going, "Oh, this guy's snake oil, like what a load of nonsense." Go and look it up. It's a fact. that from January 1923 to the end of last year, American shares have produced more than 10% annualized per annum, right? And those returns are enough to make normal people wealthy. If you do it, if you just invest in the stock market. Now, there are some other bits and pieces to that, which is stock markets are volatile. So in 99, 2000, stock markets basically halved. In 1987, stock markets plummeted. In 2007, 8, 9, stock markets plummeted. But that doesn't matter if you know what you're doing, if you're taking a very long-term view on these things, and if you invest every month from the moment you start earning money until the moment that you can then afford to live on your money, which ultimately is the idea of a pension, right? And if you do that and ignore the news and ignore all the sort of volatility in stock markets, you've got an incredibly hard, probabilistically, you have a very high chance of ending up with a high six-figure or low seven-figure salary, lump sum of wealth, almost no matter what you earn. And this, I say this stuff and it sounds a bit less radical today than it did when I started saying it, X years ago, because of podcasts like yours, right? And because there is more interest in this stuff. But this is like true, and it's just how maths works. It's because the world economy grows and innovates, and we've got wonderful. If you think about in 1800, like 90% of people were grindingly poor and lived on the land. There were no sports teams, there were no beach bars, there was no international travel. People didn't go on holiday in Spain, let alone Australia. And since then we've had aviation, shipping, automotive, silicon, like computers, smartphones, internet, and it's those things, it's that real economic development and human progress that is the reason that investment works. And the tragedy is that, again, this is slightly controversial. I always say that the richest 1% in the world today are largely just the most financially literate 1% of people in the world today, because of the power of compounding and the fact that they're investing and 99% of people aren't investing. And if you invest and you compound, you will be disproportionately wealthy compared to people who don't. And because I know that statement's quite people don't like to hear that, because it's sort of take personal responsibility for your finances, and almost no matter what you earn, you've got a chance of being wealthy. And that's not a very popular message, but contrast that with 500 years ago, where the wealthiest 1% of people in the world were the most violent 1% of people in the world, right? Yeah. And the aristocracy were basically whoever was willing to be most violent and suck up to the king the most, and then they'd give you a load of land. The world today is factually far more meritocratic, and you don't have to be violent. All you need to do is understand how this stuff works, basically.
Yeah, my concern is culture hasn't caught up, though, has it? Ironically, like you're saying, we are one of the earliest market developers. We're kind of the innovators, along with the Dutch of the stock market, and the fact that everybody can allocate, capital to markets. But I feel like we are the antithesis to America, really, because they're so very much like, guys, come on, growth, success. And we have this tall poppy syndrome in this country, whereby we view success and wealth as a bad thing, and hence probably a bit the reason maybe why I don't like either the Tories or Labour myself either, but the reason why Labour have become more popular is because people feel like maybe they can't even succeed in this country, even though the information's out there that they can. We still push down success is bad, let's tax the wealthy as much as possible, rich people are evil, and I still feel like that's how this country feels.
It is, and it's a cultural tragedy, right? Because it's like there's a great, I think it was André Balzac, the French writer, who famously said, however long ago that was, a couple hundred years ago, that behind every fortune is a great crime. And so my point about aristocrats and 500 years ago, that used to be true. Like, people who were disproportionately wealthy 200 years ago, 300 years ago, largely were because they were fundamentally dishonest and violent and whatever else. And, I like to go to the example of the Sunday Times Rich List. Actually, even as recently as 1987, of the 1,000 people on the first Sunday Times Rich List, there was something like 60% of them had inherited their wealth, and even more. And today it's like 10%. And the other 90% are people like James Dyson or Stelios from EasyJet or whoever you might want to include, or all sorts. Now, look, there are still some fairly nefarious characters. And actually, the bigger government is, the more cronyistic capitalism is. And I think, for example, it is absolutely ridiculous what Britain's doing with wind power at the moment. We're about to spend hundreds of billions of pounds to develop tons of offshore wind, which means that when the wind blows, we'll have 160% of the power requirements we need in the country. And when it doesn't, we'll have 4%, and energy will be unbelievably expensive because we've destroyed all our gas-powered turbines and we're not doing any nuclear, and we're not going to be able to build an AI industry. And why is that? Because labor is in the pocket, because there's a complete crony capitalism, and they have had the wool pulled over their eyes about, wind's great. And it's like, there's so much incompetence and cronyism. But out in the private sector, actually, to a great extent, especially in smaller companies, right? Maybe not the biggest companies that can lobby government. I quite often go back to, Vanguard and BlackRock, right, are two enormous ETF providers. I actually think that the products they provide for people are very good products because they enable you to invest cheaply and efficiently in the stock market. But part of the reason the US stock market is doing so disproportionately well at the moment, which is very poorly understood and is a kind of random technical reason, is Vanguard and BlackRock, like the defense companies, Northrop Grumman or, lobby Congress to get the Pentagon to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on like F-35 fighters. And we all know about this. All pharmaceutical companies have lobbied Congress to do this, that, and the other. And there are bad actors in the very, in the realm of very large companies. But Vanguard and BlackRock, so this is really important for why the S&P's done really well in the last few years, is Vanguard and BlackRock have basically lobbied, in my view, financially illiterate congressmen in Congress so effectively that if you run a Fortune 500 pension fund in the States nowadays, it's more than your job's worth to put that money into anything other than a really cheap like ETF. So that means that hundreds of billions of dollars is flowing into like an S&P 500 ETF all the time. And that is disproportionately, that's the reason that the top 7 tech companies, in the market are now 30% of the whole market. And, that is problematic. But that's just an example of kind of bad actors at the top of the tree. But there are millions of companies in the world, and there are tens of thousands of stock market listed companies in the world. And most of them can't afford to lobby politicians. Most of them just have to get on with doing whatever they're doing, opening a chain of restaurants or pubs or, building some new software or being a local accountancy firm or whatever they might be doing. And most of those people are actually really good actors, and they're just trying to, make more revenue than they have costs and make some profit and employ people and pay tax. And, at the moment, you're right. In Britain, we completely vilify wealth creation. And we don't admire and respect people who go through all of everything that's required to be gone through to make that happen in any kind of walk of life. And actually, just to finish off on that thought, what I find really extraordinary about all this stuff is the very policies that vilify the rich and like tax the rich and the policies of envy and a failure to understand how wealth is created and all the amazing things capitalism have given us, actually, which is, as I said earlier, like aeroplanes and, every good fruit of modernity is a function of capital markets and capitalism and wealth creation. Absolutely. And we're dismantling it all right now. But the thing that's really pernicious is that printing money and high tax, the people it punishes most are poor people. Because the reason we have if you print money, like if you have a magic money tree and say the government should do everything, the government should have hundreds of billions of dollars and give more money and have better, higher basic, higher minimum salaries, and what happens is you have inflation, which is obviously what we've just had in the last few years. Rich people can leave or are wealthy enough that it doesn't affect, it doesn't really, if you're worth millions of pounds, the fact that pasta, bread, eggs, or whatever else is up a lot, or milk, as it is, as we all know, is annoying, but it's kind of fairly incidental to your ability to actually get on with your life. If you're at the bottom end of the societal pyramid, it's really, really tricky. And it means you have to start using food banks. And that's what really annoys me about Britain's complete failure to understand how capitalism works generally as a zeitgeist, is that the people it punishes the most are the people who shout for it. And, I think that's a real problem we have societally.
Totally. I mean, I did a video yesterday on TikTok, and I was getting depressed reading through the comments last night. Yeah. And it was a video all about, the heavy taxation that is occurring in this country, not because of Labour. Obviously, Tories have done the exact same thing over the last, 15 plus years. It's all added up. And what I was essentially saying was that it's just a layer upon layer of tax. Like, and nobody gets rid of the tax. It's just another layer, or they slightly change it and then blame the last government. And every Labour supporter is like, it's going to change. It's different. Labour for the people. Screw the rich people. And that's pretty much all the comments are like that. I just thought, you guys just don't understand. That's not the problem. It is, like you said earlier, the size of the government and the incentives of the government to pocket the money. That really is the cause of all of this.
It's all of our problems, and also it's economic illiteracy, but it's also company economics. Like the amount of stuff I've seen on social media since the budget the other week saying, oh, lifting national insurance from like 12.8 to 15% or whatever it was. The small lift in national insurance. Most companies have high margins and they can afford it and all be fine. Completely fails to understand company economics, because it's because basically there are, I want to say, millions of companies in this country who function at or around break even, or who lose money. So if you're an entrepreneur that's just gone and raised money from investors to build it, because you've got this dream of building a restaurant, let's say, like a nice restaurant in a town in the UK, most restaurants lose money. Very, very few restaurants get to profitability, but that doesn't stop crazy entrepreneurs who've got a dream from going and getting a load of their mates and family to put risk capital in and, find a building and kit it out with a kitchen and a front of house and hire staff and, and so what do they then do? They hire like a few dozen staff in that town. They've given them all jobs now, right? And they might be losing money for 2 or 3 or 4 years before they finally make money. And if they're lucky and they've got supportive shareholders, their shareholders will support that. The minute that you put their national insurance up to 15% for their employees, they're now even more loss-making and even less likely to make it to profitability. And the likelihood that they're going to go bust and their shareholders are going to give up on them and go, look, wow, now it's going to take you 6 years to profitability. Look, let's just can it. Yeah. And their dreams crushed and they're done. And the same, like most pub businesses, most hotel businesses, most restaurant businesses, all startups who by definition are loss-making, because the whole, if you're a tech startup in London, whether it's in crypto or AI or, finance or whatever it might be in, you go and raise money from investors with a business plan that says it's going to take me a few years to get to profitability and I'm going to go and hire 100 people or 150 people, 200 people. If you put their national insurance up, as Rachel Reeves just has done, you've just pushed out their ability to make that. You've reduced the chance they will ever make it to profitability. And so what does that mean? It means that, I was going to say millions of businesses. That's probably an exaggeration. But if you think about how many pubs there are and how many restaurants there are, but let's just say hundreds of thousands of businesses, the economic illiteracy of people who think this is good, it can only come from somebody who's never run a business, doesn't understand a balance sheet, and has never been, raised capital from investors to start a business, right? Because it's about the margins and it's about tipping a business. If you run a business at break even, it doesn't make any profits. There are loads and loads of businesses up and down the, all over the country where that is still a viable thing to do, like local high street solicitors or whatever, right? And you could, as long as you can pay everyone's salaries, it actually doesn't matter that the business doesn't make any profit, because there's not really any shareholders. Maybe it's a partnership, it's owned by a family. But every year you can continue to pay people's salaries. Everybody gets their salary. Everybody has a job, and the business survives to the next year. Maybe some years they'll be slightly profitable. Some years they'll lose money, but they'll muddle through. The minute you change the base of that for all of these millions of businesses or hundreds of thousands of businesses, there are pub groups already saying, like, we've got 500 pubs, let's say. Now, 85 of them are unprofitable and are going to lose money. So we've got to take a decision to sell them, fire all the people who work in those pubs. And what does that mean? It means unemployment. Unemployment is going to go up by 500,000 to 1 million people in my consideration in the next few years as a result of that policy. What does that mean? The government's got much more cost in terms of paying for unemployed people. And the level of economic illiteracy from this government to have done that, it just beggars belief. And it can only have been done by people, academic economists like Rachel Reeves, who worked in retail banking at HBOS, or human rights lawyers like Keir Starmer. I think I met with some people in London yesterday, and they were saying that they don't think anyone in the current cabinet has ever actually run a private business. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that was the consensus around the table. And it's like, look, this is all going to come out in the wash, no matter what a ranty, shouty person like me wants to say, or whatever, whether we agree or disagree. The simple fact is, this is going to be incredibly bad for most people in this country because of the level of economic illiteracy amongst politicians and corporate illiteracy. People don't understand how businesses work, and then like often happens in electoral cycles. They'll have. I mean, Keir Starmer's already got the lowest approval rating, like even worse than Rishi Sunak already in how many years. And I don't want to be all political, but it's funny actually. This is like the first time I've ever had a proper party political rant. I tend to avoid it because I tend to like. I like it looking at 2 centuries of like what is the stock market, big picture, and enrichment, and how it all and capitalism. But I just find myself in the last. Yeah, exactly, and it's really, really tragic, and it's really tragic. Just the nonsense being spouted by people who've obviously just, who literally don't know what a balance sheet is, let alone how to read a balance sheet. And if I made a comment on a podcast the other day. I said something like, we can't have, if 60% of people, which by the way is, a survey establishes 60% of people in Britain don't understand what compounding is. If you don't understand what compounding is, if you don't understand how the bond market works, if you don't understand how corporate accounting works, how can you possibly think that you can have a view on capitalism without wanting to sound harsh? It's just my view, right?
It's true. Well, you just trust what the politicians say, don't you? That's what you really do. That's what the vast majority of people in the UK do. Is Labour said something that sounds kind of good, or the Tories. So yeah, let's go with that.
I tell you what, on that subject, Rachel Reeves is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, right? She's just pulled out the biggest tax budget in history, whatever thereabouts. And on the day after it, I saw more than two or three interviews that were sort of clips of them on Twitter or whatever. And she was challenged about what was happening in the gilt market, right? Which is because of what she'd done in the budget and the way that financial markets are reacting, which, by the way, affects everybody's mortgages. It's like this is not some ephemeral stuff that only people in the city need to worry about. This is what millions of normal people in this country need to worry about. And the gilt market was in a pickle the following day, and whatever else. And every journalist interview she gave that day that I saw a clip of, she was challenged about the market, and she said, I haven't seen what the market's done today. And it's like, and I'm not kidding, I genuinely think, as harsh as this is, if that journalist had said, Rachel Reeves, here is a laptop, show me how to look up what the price of the gilt market's doing today, and explain to me what that means. I actually half believe that she wouldn't know how to do that based on looking at what she's done in her life, which is being an academic economist in retail banking, not somebody at the cold face of capital markets. And and these are the people with the reins, which blows my mind. But for a chancellor to not actually know what financial markets had done the day after she, published a budget was just egregious, just astonishing. But that's the world we live in, unfortunately. We can't do anything about sort of shout at a microphone in my home office.
Let's hope it changes things.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, and
No, totally. The one thing I definitely felt change is once I started learning more about the things that you're talking about and the things that I discuss on a daily basis. Once I started thinking about it more, the more I realised that the word ownership, and in your book, is how to own, this idea of personal responsibility rather than relying on whether it's a government or somebody else to sort your situation out.
Yeah.
I feel like is the most important thing when it comes to personal finances, because you won't be hanging on every word of what a politician says the Chancellor of the Exchequer is going to say in their autumn budget, and whether that's really going to completely destroy your finances and therefore you can't afford bread and milk at the store.
Yeah.
How do you think then? Because we're talking a lot of apocalyptic kind of doom and gloom politicians and how it's affecting. But how do you think that the average person in the UK can take responsibility and ownership of their own personal finances? Is that still something that's even possible to do?
Well, it's getting a lot harder because of the stupidity of successive governments. And as I say, it's not just Labour. Under the Tories, like the last 30 years has been a slow motion car crash. That's the bad news. What I do want to just take a step back and say, so one of the things I always go back to and I talk about in all of my books is, and it's quite important to contextualise, is because we're at risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater at the moment. What I mean by that is, I think I said at the top of the call, in 1800, life was really, really rubbish for everyone, right? 95% of people were grindingly poor and worked either on the land or down a mine. Life expectancy was in your 40s. Like, it was rare, a few aristocrats lived into their 60s and 70s. 40% of children died before their 5th birthday. That, you know, people had no teeth. Like, honestly, you cannot. There's this guy, Thomas Hobbes, this philosopher, who described human existence as nasty, poor, brutish, solitary, and short. And those of us alive today, I think, would do well to stop for a minute and think about that more. Like, just how, you want to moan about your experience today and the cost of living crisis and the fact that eggs and bread and pasta and my God, a pint of beer in central London costs £7 now. Are you kidding me? Yeah. I mean, that's all rubbish, but it is as to nothing compared to what your life would have been if you'd been born in any other age of man up until about 200 years ago when things started improving. And something I said on the podcast the other day is, look at when the stock market was invented, right? Capital markets, the stock market and the bond market is, and look at what humanity has achieved in the time since. And this is what anti-capitalists don't understand, and seemingly people like the Labour Party, is the because basically you had to have an agricultural revolution, which, happened in, let's say, 1400, 1500, 1600, after the last mini ice age and Black Death and bubonic plague, and when things were really, really bad, when like 60% of human beings in the world died from disease, right? That's how bad it was. Compared to COVID's like 0.9%. That's how far we've come, right? Mm-hmm. That's how grindingly awful the world was. And every day you went out your front door, you're at risk of dying in an accident, or, if you went to the next village along, there was a good chance that some cutthroat would kill you in the middle of the night and nick all your purse with copper coins in it, and and you lived on potatoes, right? So I'm ranting a bit. I think this
sounds
is
a bit like the Labour government, though.
Well, sadly, this is the direction we may be heading back towards, because people don't fully appreciate this point. But it's like, so you had an agricultural revolution which created enough surplus to then have a class of artisans and but basically. So you had agricultural revolution, you then had a technological revolution, industrial revolution, but most importantly, you had a financial revolution. Mm-hmm. So the introduction of double entry bookkeeping, accounting, which basically happened in Italy and Venice and Milan and, in sort of 14th, 15th century, 16th century. And then you had the British and the Dutch. The Italians came up with this idea of bonds. The British and the Dutch came up with this idea of shares. Which is basically that nobody could afford to put enough money together in one place to build a skyscraper, or a big metal boat, or any of the things that we take for granted today, had the stock market not come into existence, right? So the stock market, people have really erroneous ideas about the stock market. It's for the rich. It's like, the stock market is one of the fundamental technologies that has underpinned modernity and human progress. And without it, if you actually just walk down a British street, even a British street with lots of boarded up buildings and charity shops right now because of the state of our economy, but even still, if you walk down your average British street and look around you, and just think what was required to have streetlights and electricity and, any and everything that we completely take for granted, like bricks and tarmac and concrete. And, this is all a function of the creation of capital markets, the technological progress. But without capital markets, we couldn't have concentrated capital and syndicated shared risk across, many thousands of human beings to achieve all these amazing things. And so I guess that's the first thing, is to really understand in a visceral way what capital markets have given us, which might make people stop and think for a moment about hating it, like, oh, bloody stock market, it's for rich people. Because actually, the other point I make a lot is financial markets are not for rich people. That gets correlation and causality the wrong way around. It's just that the people who learn about capital markets have a much higher probability of being rich, particularly families that have learned about capital markets that have done it for several generations, right? And so then, what can people do about that? Okay, well, acknowledge that they're a good thing. And actually, I've just this morning been writing a whole section on, okay, but what about the environment for my next book? It's like, yeah, but this endless growth is causing industrial despoilment and pollution and, energy consumption and global warming, and the world's going to end, which is also complete nefarious. Without wanting to sound like an unrepentant tech bro, there are so many reasons why and I've just written a book about it, actually, my latest book, Our Future is Biotech, why there are just unbelievable technologies coming down the pipe that are going to, most of our remaining problems as a species are about biology. So environmental degradation, curing cancer, et cetera, et cetera. And we're teetering on the brink of having technologies that are going to make a massive difference. So what we need is more capitalism, because we need to support the businesses that are making those technological developments, not less, which sadly is 180 degrees the opposite of what most people want. So I guess my point is, if you acknowledge what these things have given us, right, then the next step is to say, okay, well, that has worked. And if you agree with the thesis that becoming an owner and becoming an investor and that is all that is getting financial exposure to human progress. Because people who have financial exposure to that human progress, the world economy in 1985 was worth about $12 trillion in total, right? Last year it was worth $96 trillion. The world economy has grown 670% since 1985, right? Who's benefited from that? People who invest. Who has not benefited from that? People who don't invest and are getting crushed by inflation, right? So as a private individual, you've got to decide a number of things. You've got to decide, right, first, this is something I should be doing. You know, to your point, most British adults don't even know what stocks and shares ISA is. You know, that's why I wrote my first book, is what is a share? What is the history of the stock market? Why did it come into being? What's a bond? What's gold? Why is gold important in the finance? All the nuts and bolts, you know, we're called plain English finance, right? That's the whole thing. And it's like, so understand and by the way, understanding this stuff is no harder. It takes no more hours. Everybody takes it for granted you learn how to drive a car, right? What percentage of adults learn how to drive a car in their late teens? I mean, it's a pretty high percentage, right? Everybody thinks that's normal. Oh, you learn how to drive. Nobody goes, oh my God, you learn how to drive a car? That's incredible. That's not what we do. But if you say, actually, I know quite a lot about the stock market and I invest, they're like, oh my God. And actually, one of my genuine beliefs is that the number of tens of hours required to learn how to drive a car is about the same as the number of tens of hours required to have a basic understanding of what is a share, what is a bond, what is an ISA, what's my pension, and, you know, how do I invest? And so then the last thing is, once you've understood all that stuff, and this is a really important point of differentiation, because it's the difference between investing and trading. And most people nowadays, particularly young people who see stuff on social, and they've got all these crypto groups and trading groups, they conflate the ideas of investing and trading, and they are not the same thing. They're two completely different things. Investing is doing something every month from the minute you can afford to for 30 years. And if you do that with, let's say, ideally 10, if you basically decide that you're going to live on 90% of what you earn forever for your whole life, and you invest 10% of it in human progress, which basically means the stock market, and it's a bit more to it than that, but broadly, you have a very, very high chance, probabilistically, of being quite wealthy by the time you want to retire. And if you do it, if you're lucky enough to be a high earner and you do it really well and you start early, you could retire a lot younger than most people think is normal as well, right? But, you know, sadly, 99% of people don't learn about this stuff, and they wake up when they're 45 in a cold sweat and go, oh my God, pensions, oh my God, what? Which is a complete scandal. It's why I'm writing a book for teenagers and young adults, right? So the simple answer is, like, understand what it is, understand that it's important, understanding that it's the fundamental underpinning of everything we enjoy in the modern world. You wouldn't be able to go and watch football teams at the weekend were it not for capital markets, because we wouldn't be able to build stadiums that cost tens of millions of pounds. You wouldn't be able to fly to another country to go on holiday if it wasn't for capital markets, because aeroplanes wouldn't exist. Like, you wouldn't have cancer drugs. You know, there wouldn't be chemo treatments or whatever, which I admit aren't perfect and we're improving on at the moment. But, you know, your likelihood of dying of disease or of your child dying in child, you know, would be immeasurably higher were it not for capital markets. So kind of stop kicking up against them and going, oh, they're dreadful things for rich people and everyone in the city's an arsehole, because it's just ignorant nonsense. Realize how important they are and how transformational their creation has been for humanity, and get involved and learn enough to be, because as I say, it's no harder than learning how to drive a car. It's just that nobody does it. But the people who do it have a much better chance of having a much better life.
And the accessibility of it now, I mean, a couple of decades ago, it was quite hard. The rich people kind of were the ones that had the access to brokers and had the ability to even get the knowledge, whereas now we have access to information through the internet. We can download an app very quickly to get access to a tax efficient way of investing in the entire world stock market. But the biggest thing for me, and you touched on that a second ago, is the idea of doing it consistently for a long period of time. The biggest pushback that I get, and I think the biggest barrier to entry for people to start investing, is a short-term mindset. and it's
100%.
not thinking any further than a couple of years, and that's partly, I suppose, because of the generation that's inherited kind of what's happened since stock market crashes and housing crises, where now actually the multiple of somebody's average salary to the average house is 12 versus 3 or 4 it was just one generation ago. So people are thinking more of, I can't actually squirrel away a little bit. They can, but mentally they can't. So they're looking for that quick gamble of crypto bro, let's make it
exactly
rich quick.
Which is 180 degrees the wrong thing to do, because we can't control, like, governments have held interest rates artificially low. House prices are inversely related to interest rates. House prices are structurally very high. My view on that is that I rent, and again, we have all these completely fallacious beliefs about financial markets that are born of ignorance and a failure to understand stuff. Like, renting is throwing money away. No, it's not, because to your point, if house prices, and I'm not saying they will, right? And by the way, the other reason I rent is because I'm an entrepreneur, and all the money I've accrued in 25 years of work, I'm now basically putting it all on black, building my business, right? So I need my capital at the moment to fund me and invest in my company, because I'm a risk-taking entrepreneur, which is perhaps why I feel particularly unhappy about the recent budget, given how much harder it makes it for me. But anyway. House prices did nothing from 1900 to 1965, basically. They're basically flat in the UK, right? And house prices since the early 70s are up massively, more because of the depreciation in fiat currencies than actually because of the appreciation in real terms of house prices. Now, house prices in various... But, there are structural reasons why house prices have gone up in many parts of the UK, which is immigration and bigger population and more households. More people want to live apart and live in smaller households. The idea that house prices always go up is kind of completely nefarious. And, I always talk about the fact that the housing ladder can actually be a housing snake. And people don't realize. Oh, that was the point I was going to make, is that, so how do you illustrate the fact that nominal? So that it's really important to understand the difference between nominal increases in the price and real increases in the price, which is inflation adjusted increase in the price. So, somebody buys a house in 20 years ago for 100 grand, let's say, and it's now worth £1 million, and it's like, whoopee, I've made 10 times. I'm 10 times wealthier. But you've got to take a step back and say, are they wealthier in terms of houses in their neighborhood? So they still only have one house in the street they're in. And if they were to sell that house and buy another house on the same street, all of the other houses have gone up 10x. So in relative terms, in purchasing power parity, and plus the fact that if a pint of beer was Keith Massey's was a quid when you bought your house for 100 grand, and a pint of beer is now 10 quid and your house is £1 million, and the same is true as everything else. A Volkswagen Golf was a grand, and a Volkswagen Golf is now 25 grand. What that's telling you is you're not making real wealth. Now, as I say, there are lots of, one of the big, what economists call exogenous shocks in the UK in the last sort of 30 plus years is the hundreds and hundreds of billions of pounds that came into British property from overseas. And I always used to argue with my dad about this. It's like in the early 80s, when my dad bought a house in southwest London, there were 4 billion people in the world. Today, there are 8 billion people in the world. And an awful lot of the rich ones want to be in the UK and want to have a property in the UK, which is surprising given what a lot of British people feel about their country and are all upset. There are still most rich Chinese, most rich Indians, most rich Russians, most rich Libyans, these people all, because Britain is safe, it doesn't have volcanoes or hurricanes, or it's got a great education system, it's got the rule of law, etc., etc. They want their kids to go to British schools and universities, and what that's meant is, if you think about a middle class couple living in southwest London who bought a house for 500 grand 20 years ago, I'm not kidding when I say that some of those people have been able to sell that house for 20 million quid to a Russian oligarch or a Nigerian oil baron. And that 20 million quid is not just relevant to Knightsbridge or Mayfair or Chelsea or wherever, because their 3 adult kids, let's say, have just been given 5 million quid each of inheritance. There you go. And they go and buy houses a little bit, in Kent or Essex or Surrey or whatever. And then the, school teacher or black cab driver or whomever else that is selling those kids their house in Kent or Surrey or Wiltshire or whatever can buy a retirement home in, wherever they like. And that impact, UK house prices have been buoyed up by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of pounds coming into like prime UK real estate and cascading out to everyone else. And you know, how sustainable can that be? And so, yeah, I think, again, it all goes back to education. I cover all of this stuff in my first book. It's like, you need, if all you think about is property and cash, the fact that might have worked for the last 30 or 40 years does not mean it's going to work in the next 30 or 40 years. And you need to be thinking in many decades, ideally even centuries, and understand economic history to really understand what is a balanced approach to your own personal financial affairs. And that means you need to understand all the main asset classes. I mean, and it's not, you need to know what the stock market is, the bond market is, precious metals, gold, commodities, and property. And if you have a basic understanding of all of those things, and you use the right mix of all of those things throughout your life with a long-term mindset, you have a much higher chance of having a much easier, wealthier life than people who don't. And it's not that hard.
Totally. I feel like people have been lied to for the last, couple of decades about this, or even longer, that your house is your biggest asset. Like, once, if you just get the biggest house you can, the most expensive house you can, over time it's going to appreciate. But like, to what you were saying earlier, the house that you're in doesn't get any more valuable, unless something happens nearby in a neighborhood that does increase the neighborhood's value.
Unless, but like, you're exactly right. It's a terrible idea to say your house is your pension, unless, which is perfectly acceptable, you want to play this game, look, if a lot of middle-class people in this country have made a lot of money out of property because they, if you change your house and upgrade and upgrade and upgrade and upgrade, and you're quite wealthy, and a couple that are both paid quite well, now you might now have a £6 million house, right? And actually, if there's still a bid for that £6 million house, and you'll be perfectly happy living in a £2.5 million house. And by the way, this might sound really inaccessible, but there are tens of thousands of people, or even probably more than that, for whom that has actually happened, right? Yeah. And so, because if you own a very, very valuable property, and because you've made so much money, your mortgage on it is a very, your loan to value is really low, and you've actually got a few million quid of equity, and you'd be perfectly happy in a smaller house in somewhere rural because you don't need to live near London or Leeds or Manchester or wherever you might live anymore. That's a massively good result. But I guess my point is, I think in the next few decades, there are going to be far fewer people who are going to be able to achieve that, right? Because markets trend over many decades, and you also have to keep a weather eye on demographics, because I've made this point in a couple of interviews recently, but so in like 2001, there was something like 100,000 people in Britain over the age of 90. And, I don't know what the number was. Let's call it 1 million people in Britain over the age of 80, or 2 million people in Britain, or whatever. The point I'm making is, by 2021, there are now 650,000 people over the age of 90, and many, many millions of people over the age of 80. And the biggest, the thing that's going to could potentially crush the property market, apart from Labour's policies destroying our economy and there being fewer wealthy people who can afford to buy houses at these elevated levels, is the simple fact that when, like, the biggest structural sellers of homes are dead people, without wanting to sound too harsh, because usually when somebody dies, more often than not, the estate of, when they die, the first thing, or what gets done is they sell the family home, because especially now, you think about somebody who dies who has 3 adult children, none of those adult children can afford to buy their £2.5 million house and buy out the other 2 kids, because they're on normal salaries doing normal jobs. And as you say, whether it's 8 times salary or 12 times salary, it's a huge multiple of most people's salaries, and most people can't afford that. So then they have to put the house on the market. And if there's a flood of houses going on the market in the UK in the next few years at the same time, and far fewer, and by the way, 10,000 millionaires have left for Dubai or Switzerland, which is also going on at the same time, and all the non-doms are gone, who's going to buy these 2, 3, 4 million pound houses? And so what happens? The price craters. So, I have to say, that's the other reason I rent, which is that on a sort of 5 to 10 year view, I genuinely think British property in the next 5 to 10 years can be a very, very different story to what it's been in the last 10 years. I could be wrong. Things could change, but I think again, if you look at a century's worth of history and a century's worth of interest rate data, I said this in a podcast the other day, I don't think anybody should be allowed to take out a mortgage unless they've looked at the 50-year record of interest rates. That should be a legal requirement. Because, have all these people take out mortgages and stretch themselves, and two couples working, paying 2/3 of their, because keeping up with the Joneses and whatever else, to have the most expensive property possible when properties are at all-time highs, when interest rates are at all-time lows, and then they're like, oh my God, interest rates have doubled. My monthly payments have gone from 1,500 quid a month to 4 grand a month, right? Which has just happened to hundreds of thousands of people. And the property market wouldn't be so elevated if millions more people knew what the 50-year interest rate was. Like, in all seriousness. But anyway, go on. So I'm really sorry. I'm ranting. I've definitely...
I'm enjoying it. I enjoyed that take, actually, of the potential future for property and the reasons why. I've never really heard it put that way before. It makes a lot of sense. And this idea that people are going to become wealthy from their residential property, for the vast majority, is just, certainly outside London, is just not true. All it means is your purchasing power of your money is decreasing. That's all that is. It's not that your wealth increasing.
Yeah, look, if you've paid off your mortgage and you own a £1.2 million house in wherever, that is great, as long as you're happy to sell it and move into a £400,000 house. Because, how much, realistically, so let's say interest rates are 5% to keep the maths easy. If you've got £1 million in your pension, that will pay you 50 grand a year. And the government will pay you 10 grand a year, and that's probably going south because the government's basically bankrupt, right? And because the government's caught between the rock of, basically the only way the government can afford to pay out all the liabilities and fund the NHS and everything else in the years ahead is by printing money, which is, and then that creates inflation. So this is something I meant to say when you're like, why should people, half an hour ago, whatever it was, why should people take responsibility for their own finances? And one of the simple answers is because the government can't do it for you anymore because of demographics. And so my point being is, let's say you've got a property that's worth £1 million, but your pension's really small. And you've been telling people at dinner parties for 20 years, my house is my pension because it's worth £1 million, right? And I don't have a mortgage. Okay, but the only way you can get the £1 million out is by selling it, and then you still need to live somewhere. And so, if you've got £1 million of equity in your property, well, if you buy the only way you can turn that into an income is by having lodgers live with you, or by selling it and buying a much cheaper property. And again, I don't think enough people think about that. But yeah, to go back to that point, just on why should people be thinking about this stuff? Well, the good news is because it will make you a lot wealthier if you do. That's the good news. That's the carrot. The stick and the bad news is because it's never been more important than history. Because so we created the pension system in 1909 for people over the age of 70, when life expectancy was 47. I was actually working on this the other day. It's fascinating. So America, Germany, Austria, Australia, New Zealand, all these modern democracies came up with their pension systems anywhere from Germany did it first in the 1880s. We did it in 1909. The Americans came up with Social Security in I think the 20s, whatever. But the point I was making is it's hilarious. It was sort of slightly sneaky and a bit depressing actually, but you can understand why they did it. But all of these countries that came up with this new amazing thing called the pension system, the rule was that you started getting a pension a year or two above what average life expectancy was. So they were like, we've got this great new thing called a pension that when you get to, when you get and in the UK it was 70. For the elderly poor, anybody over the age of 70, you'll get a lovely pension and the government will look after you. Most people died in their 40s or certainly in their early 50s, right? So there were relatively few people who survived and could collect the pension, and the system worked because there were lots of people paying tax and paying into the system and not that many people taking out. Well, today we've got, even people who have pretty poor health habits are going to live to 80 or 90. And, people who have good health habits are going to live to 100 and some, given the technological developments going on. So if you want to retire at 60, you're going to need to fund yourself for 40 years. And there's just it doesn't matter whether Labour are in power or the Tories are in power. It's just an economic inevitability that the government will not be able to pay you enough to live on because they just cannot afford, especially in Britain, where we've had 30 years of terrible policy decisions about things like, our industrial power in the UK is 4 times the cost of what it is in America. It's amazing that anybody can build a business in the UK at the moment. Certainly not any power intensive, and we're certainly not going to do AI. So, we've made all these terrible policy decisions. We're getting poorer and poorer. And the only way that you can address that is not by voting Labour or by voting for any, is you have to take personal responsibility to learn about investment and sort yourself out. And totally. I think that's a statement of fact, not opinion.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And some people, if I ever talk about the state pension and say, oh, it might not be there in the future, people are always like, oh, you're just scaremongering. But it's literally a Ponzi scheme. It is literally, they are just using today's money.
Well, yeah, it's also 10 grand today.
Exactly. How can you live off that in the future?
Yeah, I mean, so if you've made no private provision for yourself at all, you're going to have to live on 10 grand.
Yeah, what a life.
It's there or thereabouts, right? Yeah, and I mean, exactly with cost. And by the way, inflation is almost certainly going to carry on. I think it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to get on top of inflation, particularly given what Rachel Reeves is doing at the moment, right?
No, absolutely. Okay, so this idea then of owning the world. I am a huge advocate for index funds and owning the world and diversifying your money across the world in low-cost index funds. How would you describe to somebody? I mean, most people listening to this are going to know what an index fund is. But you do a great job in the book of explaining it to somebody who's probably never heard of it. Could you just give a brief description, outline of what it means to own the world through an index fund or some type of fund?
Well, yeah, so basically an ETF or an exchange traded fund they first came out, and the very first ones, I think, were in the mid 90s or late 90s, and then since then there's been this massive explosion of them. And they're just a product that enables a private individual or enables anyone to put a small amount of, you can put 25 quid a month into 3,000 companies, because of these products, right? So basically they're just a product from a product provider that's like, okay, here you go. The FTSE All World Index includes basically, it's actually about 4,200, I think, off the top of my head, companies in the world. The trackers, the ETFs that track that index, have fewer companies than that because it's quite hard to own all the illiquid ones, and obviously administratively it's very hard for a fund to own thousands and thousands of companies. But they own more than 3,000 companies. So it's just this is one of the points I make in my book is how financial products are the best they've ever been. Everybody wants to go on about greedy bankers and this, that, and the other, but actually innovation in financial services means it's never been easier or cheaper or more powerful. We joke about, what was it? Was it the CEO of one of the car companies? Bill Gates had been slagging off one of the big Detroit American car manufacturers, and the CEO wrote this quite famous meme piece that went around online about how if basically because Microsoft software crashes all the time. And anyway, no, that was a terrible example to go to because I can't remember it properly, so I'll move swiftly on, but look it up, it's quite funny. But so ETF anyway, the point is there's been amazing innovation, and these things are great products, and but just to take a step back, so my second book is called Live on Less, Invest the Rest, and it's basically explaining an idea which has been around for a few decades, which is which we call 100 minus your age, which is basically that let's start with something called the market purist approach. So very rich people like Warren Buffett will say that if you want to invest, all you need to do is own the stock market from the minute you start investing in, say, your 20s for 30 years, and you will be sufficiently wealthy, and you don't have to worry about volatility, stock market crashes, because if you just do it every month forever. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're worth 10 million quid at the end of that, because you're a very high earner or you were wealthy to begin with, whatever else, or like Warren Buffett, $100 billion plus dollars, and you're 60 and you've got 100 million or 10 million quid, and there's a 50% stock market crash, which is what happens every 10 years or so, you've still got 5 million quid, right? And so it doesn't really affect your ability to kind of live your life, which is why very rich people can be what I describe as a market purist. They just invest in the stock market. And lots of Americans do that. Lots of highly paid software engineers or tech bros or people who work in AI just to buy the market every month for many, many years. And if you've got several $1 million in a big down crash for the market, it doesn't affect your ability to live your life. It will then bounce based on the record of 200 years of history, and you'll be fine again, and your $5 million will be back to $10 million. So that's fine. But for mere mortals, let's say you're worth 1 million quid, you're a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant or a software engineer or whatever, and you've spent 30 years actually doing all the stuff we teach and just investing regularly, and you're lucky enough to have a pension pot of £1 million, which, by the way, is a very realistic aspiration for most people, which, again, I explain why that is in my book, because of the power of compounding, or certainly £500,000, but between £500,000 and £1 million. If you have £1 million and there's a 50% stock market crash, now you've got 500 grand. That's actually really bad. Like that, let's say you're 60 and you want to retire and you have £1 million, there's a stock, all your money's in the stock market, there's a stock market crash, now you've got 500 grand, just as you want to retire and support yourself for the rest of your life. That is catastrophic. And then let's take the example of a 30-year-old who's got 10 grand. Let's say a 30-year-old's been really diligent, they've been working all through their 20s, they managed to squirrel a bit away, and they've got 10 grand of savings. The person with 10 million quid isn't really that affected by a stock market crash because they've still got 5 million and it will bounce. The person with $1 million is heavily affected because that's their pension, and they're going to probably have to pull their horns in and be much more defensive. A 30-year-old with 10 grand isn't that affected either, because actually they've got 30 years left for returns to build back up, and it's only 5 grand. It's annoying, and it's a holiday or a car, or whatever, but it's not like life-changingly awful like it is for the 60-year-old. And the reason I mention all that is because there's this kind of elegant way of thinking about how you allocate your investments, not just to the stock market, which is risky and will crash 50% every few years, but between what we call aggressive investments and defensive investments, right? So aggressive investments will make you higher returns, but have a chance of crashing and losing you money. Defensive investments will make lower returns, but won't crash. And so if the way to get the mix of those roughly right as you get older is very simply to do a calculation of 100 minus your age tells you what percentage to have in aggressive stuff. And this isn't my idea. This has been an idea of like smart, American fund investment advisors have used this idea probably since the 50s. And it basically means, so, if you're 30, you have 70, and you're investing every month, you have 70% of that going into something aggressive. So world stock markets or American stock markets or whatever you might want, a stock market. And you don't really have to think deeply about that. Just own a stock market that has hundreds or preferably thousands of companies in it. Very easy to do, very cheap to do, loads of powerful apps you can do that with. 70% of your money each month goes into that, and 30% of your money goes into something defensive. And if you're 70, you flip it so that you should only be 30% aggressive and 70% defensive. And if you like, that is, and just to finish, if you're 50, you're probably half aggressive and half defensive, right? And that's not a hard and fast prescriptive rule of do this exact thing, but it's just an elegant way of broadly thinking about, allocating your investments to risky things that might go up a lot and less risky things which hopefully won't fall much over many, many years of investment. And if you do that with 10% of what you earn every month for at least 20 years, preferably 30 or even 40 years, like I always say from 25 to 65 is the ideal. Hopefully most people who sort out their arse from their elbow can start investing even 25 quid a month when they're 25, right? Even if you work in a bar or whatever you do, because the other insight is, even if you've only got a really, really small amount of money to get to work, and we always say 25 quid a month is kind of the entry ticket amount, because a lot of the big UK investment platforms allow you to invest 25 quid a month. Do it for all sorts of reasons. I mean, firstly, because you'd be amazed at what a difference 25 quid a month will have from 25 to 65 when you're 65. People, if you look at how compounding works, it can actually be a lot of money. But actually, more importantly, because as has been shown by psychologists for years, it's the same as any habit, going to the gym or, revising for exams or whatever, is if you do nothing, you do nothing, and you're likely to do nothing forever. If you do something, you get a habit formed, and that 25 quite quickly becomes 50. And then in your early 30s, it might become 100. And then in your late 30s, when you've got a promotion, it might become 250. And then your 40s, when you're a company director, it might then be 500 a month. And the mere fact that you kicked yourself onto a trajectory where you think about these things, it kind of gamifies it. It means you're in the game, and then you improve your game over time, like anything else. Like as I say, if you don't exercise at all, your trajectory in terms of health and fitness over the next 30 years is going to be really, really bad. If you start some kind of exercise habit, the likelihood is that you'll gradually improve that exercise habit over time, because that's what most people do who start an exercise habit, because they get into it and they run more, they do more press ups, and they go to the gym more, and they do different activities, and they get really into it and do Ironmans and triathlons. Whereas if you don't, and money is analogous to that. If you start with a little bit and do that over, you're more likely to sort of think about it and do it. So sorry, I'm not being very concise today.
No. It all makes perfect sense. I think you're being more concise than you think you are. But I think with this idea of just starting is great, because even like the people who struggle to pull the trigger with investing, I always say this very same thing. Like, even if you just put £5 in, like to like trading 2-on-2, not sponsored in any way, but as an example, you can put so little in, and you can just leave it there for like a couple of months and just check it regularly, so you can see, oh, it's gone down to £4.20, oh, it's gone up to £7. That kind of, you kind of go, oh, this isn't, it's not gone to zero. Like, okay, maybe I can put a bit more in, and then you just get used to it. You talk about it more, and then all of a sudden you're investing loads.
I think that's right, but a really, really important thing I come back to again and again and again with all we do in social, and lots of comments coming back to us on social media and everything else is this the difference between investing and trading. And investing is taking 10% of what you earn as a bolted on, gilt edge, lockdown life habit that you've decided to do forever until you have enough money to live on. And so a really insidious thing is, because if you do that, even in volatile stock markets, every single month from, let's say, the age of 25, at least do it until you're 55, and I was going to say don't touch the money. If you do that and you find yourself with like 107 grand in your investment accounts when you're 43, and you want to take a holiday or buy a car or whatever you might want to do, then you're going to be, the people who didn't do that don't have 107 grand in their investment account. If there's a cost of living crisis, the people who do this are much less challenged by that cost of living crisis than the people who don't do it. And, to stress, it's not about income. It's about habit and about investment returns and about compounding. But the point is, if you want the maximum result, if you want to have £1 million or more when you're 60, you want to, where possible, this should be part of your life that you don't touch. Right? That you just do on autopilot for many years. And, by all means, look at the app if you want. But you've got to really, really... and actually, this is where, you do need to read a book like mine or read Morgan Housel's Psychology of Money, because this is a completely siloed activity which will deliver you an amazing result, which it needs to be thought about philosophically like that for you to get that amazing result. And it's not, I'm going to do it for a few months and, oh, look, isn't that nice? I've made a few quid and I'm going to spend that on a dress or a holiday or a night out with my mates or whatever. This is like, has to be philosophically something you do completely separate from what you do with the other 90% of your money, right? And the pushback on that is often, well, okay, I'm saving for a deposit on a house, and it's like, well, actually, if you want to save, if you want to do a really balanced thing, so there's a really famous book called The Richest Man of Babylon. It's been around for years, and it's a bit weird, and it's a bit like written in kind of weird, archaic language. But to give you an example of how people used to think about this when that book was written, which I think was in like the 20s or 30s, the basic thesis is that you should live like your roof over your head should be a third of your expenditure. Life should be a third of your expenditure, like food and travel and whatever else, and then you should save a third. That was like the sort of rule of thumb for decades, right? When before interest rates were stupidly low and house prices were stupidly high, and look, I appreciate that's a really hard thing to achieve now, particularly if you're young. But actually, and that's why we always talk about 10%. But if you do succeed in your career, the best way to sort of get to a point where you can be delivering a supernormal result for yourself is to save and invest a lot more than 10% of what you earn every month. And a lot of people, when they get into their, let's say, late 30s or 40s or 50s, and they've been promoted and they're earning a lot more money, if they're lucky enough to be in a career which progresses like that, get a much more expensive car and spend tens of thousands of pounds taking their kids on expensive holidays and or at least have lifestyle creep, when actually they would genuinely be better served by, I don't think my wife would laugh if she watches this. I don't go on holiday at the moment because I'm an entrepreneur at all. And luckily my children are young and they don't mind a couple of days in the Isle of Wight or Cornwall or whatever, which compares to, lots of very glamorous travel and holidays I did in my 20s and 30s when I had disposable income. But my broad point would be that even though my earnings power went up in my career, my expenditure didn't really change. My expenditure on groceries didn't change. My expenditure on rent didn't change that much. me at 35 versus me at 23. There was actually relatively little difference. So all the surplus could go into investments. And I think too few people think that way. I think, I was seeing there's a lady on LinkedIn who posts about all things finance, and she posted something about how, somebody who had a £1,500 a month car payment. And I was like, it beggars belief to me that anybody would have a £1,500 a month car payment like going on, unless you are extremely wealthy. Like if you're making hundreds of thousands, but then you should just buy a car outright and not have a payment because a ton of that is interest cost, right? And it's like, I think if people are really, really honest with themselves and they do a really serious budgeting exercise, you can make that 10% a bit bigger. And if you do and you succeed with it, then not only are you building to the sort of £1 million pot when you turn 60 or 65, but hopefully you can take out chunky bits along the way for a house deposit or a car or a holiday or whatever. I think the other broad point I want to make is I do see so much online about how, millennials today and, young people today are screwed and the world's never been harder and like and it's just that completely fails to understand the long run impact of compounding in human progress. In some ways it's harder, house prices are harder, so rent. Get the best possible result you can get for you comparing buying a property or renting a property that costs you a third of your income each month, and do that. And if you're like, my mates are buying houses, most of them are stretching like hell to buy houses, and it will have been a terrible decision for them economically on a 30-year view. Like, be more thoughtful about it. Be more thoughtful about the maths. Be more thoughtful about what might happen to interest rates and house prices and demographics, right? Because, my decisions about housing, I take a 20 or 30-year view when I think about whether to rent or buy, right? And if you do that, you're much less likely to be keeping up with the Joneses and desperately keen to get on the housing ladder, which in Britain is incredibly powerful. Because, and I genuinely think the decisions I make about housing by being a renter for a few years at this stage of my life, on a 20 or 30-year view, could save me a very, very large amount of money in terms of interest paid to banks, and also the fact that I'm pretty confident I'm going to be able to buy my dream, forever home for an awful lot less a few years from now than what it would have been at peak if I'd bought it in, say, 2017 or 2018 or something. That's just my view. I'm taking a view, but I think more, I've met estate agents who don't know what rental yield means, right? And it's like, if you don't know the relationship between rental yield and capital values and cap rates and interest rates and inflation, and you probably shouldn't be making an investment in something as consequential as a property. So my thesis is just people need to understand these things in a much more nuanced way. Or like currencies. If you bought a £1 million house in 2008, that was a $2 million house because the pound used to buy $2 in 2008. A £1 million house today is a $1.3 million house. So actually, you've lost $700,000. Okay, now you haven't, because the house you bought in 2008 would have gone up in pounds, right? But I'm just making the point that most things that we need in our lives are priced in dollars, like oil and gas and rice and cotton and coffee and copper and wheat and whatever, right? Especially energy commodities. And so if you think only in pounds about house prices, you're not thinking about true value and the true appreciation in the value of that asset. If you don't think in other, or compare house prices to gold. That's another way of doing it, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, sorry, again, I'm ranting away.
No, that was actually everyone who are true Bitcoiners that I've ever spoken to use that exact same logic of, if you actually price, gold could be the same because it's it's sound money, but if you think of it, a house in how much and how many ounces of gold it would cost to buy it, actually, Bitcoin in particular, because it's it'll actually be going down. It would be deflationary because of how the asset price has been pushed up so much. But you're totally right. If you just think in pounds, you feel like you're getting richer. But again, it goes back to you're just losing purchasing power. But this idea, actually, that you're talking about then about how paying yourself first, which from The Richest Man in Babylon, which is one of the first books, along with your book, your first book that I read when I was getting into this stuff. it's a powerful concept that you can only really, I think, get once you start doing it. A bit like investing. You can only once you have a few months behind you of living on 90% of what you earn rather than 100%, and using, lifestyle creep kind of pushing you up. And that's how people get to the £1,500 car payment, is because it starts at 200, doesn't it? And then it gets to 250 and they get a pay rise. But really, if they just got 10%, then 11%, then 12% investing over time, it wouldn't happen.
Sorry to interrupt you, but just quickly. So my car payment for the last several years has been 150 quid a month, and it's a really nice car. Now, admittedly, I put like a few grand in at the beginning because I was, but only if, not like tens of thousands of pounds, like a few grand, and it's a, it's one of my dream cars, and I just cannot, I cannot understand, the thought of people being on like, I don't know, 40 or 50,000 pound salaries, let's say, and paying 1,500 quid a month for a car payment, which I suspect there are people out there doing that. It's just, and then they're going to hit 60, have no pension, have no savings, and blame the government. It's like there are millions of people making these sorts of decisions, and it's really tricky for them as individuals and for us as a society.
Well, definitely. I mean, the pushback I get when I talk about long-term mindset or investing for the long term, it's the biggest pushback I get will be, well, tomorrow's not guaranteed, is it? You need to live your life now, which obviously there's certainly truth to that statement, but there is a balance that can be made. But this idea of like, well, why do I want to squirrel all my money away and be a multimillionaire just before I die and not be able to enjoy it? Which is a thought, like a concept that I've been thinking about quite a lot recently. Is this idea of like what is enough? When is enough and what is enough? What are your thoughts on that? Like having a target of like, I want to accrue this much money by this point. What is the why do we do that? Because we don't know.
So there are a few things to say about that. The first thing I wanted to say is one of the biggest barriers to this idea, exactly your point. People go like, I want to live today. I want to live on like porridge and whatever and have a crap life and not go on holiday and then be a millionaire at 60. Now, part of the reason, so the first thing is that part of the reason people feel that way is, and this has been shown by psychologists as well, is if you or I contemplate our 65-year-old self, I'm 49, so maybe I should be talking about my 80-year-old self, because 65 is coming up quite quickly, rather worryingly. But anyway, if a 25-year-old thinks about their 65-year-old self, that person conceptually is as alien and other to them as a 65-year-old stranger walking past on the street, right? So it's very, very hard psychologically and emotionally to sacrifice current consumption and enjoyment for the benefit of a stranger, 65-year-old you or 80-year-old me, right? But you have to be psychologically strong and you have to do it. And so the reason for that is because if you don't, they're going to be very, very poor. Right, and so actually the stick. I'm a big believer in the carrot. And won't it be nice? You'll be a millionaire and you'll be able to have loads of holidays. And actually, that's not what it's about. The first thing it's about is, trust me when I say that no government is going to be able to fund people affected. The pension is already on its knees and crap. And pensioners and so many people in this country, pensioners in this country are already verging on destitute. Right? I mean, just look at the furore we've just had over the winter fuel allowance. Right, that's already happened. Most of the structural trends that have created the problem today are going to get worse, because they're going to be a high percent, as I said earlier, they're going to be a higher percentage of old people, fewer people paying tax, terrible government policy, London Stock Exchange falling apart. There are all, our energy policy is going to make electricity even more expensive because we're so stupid. What we're doing, it's so stupid, and so that's going to get worse. So really the argument is, why should you be doing this? Because if you don't, honestly, you're going to be really, really poor. And then the next thing is, okay, how much is enough, or is it worth sacrifice? The other thing I'd say is, living on 90%, it's not actually that much of a sacrifice if you really think it through and if you really honestly interrogate what you're spending your money on. Because most people, and again, let's be clear, through your life cycle of your whole life. Because I know when I was 22, my rent was a brutally big shark's bite of what I was earning. And, if I went out like once or twice in a month, I was done, right? All my money had gone because I wasn't earning very much money. But, most people who are diligent and have a career, progression of any kind get a little bit better off as they get older. But my point is, over a lifetime, if the average amount throughout your adult life that you can put away as 10% and you can live on 90% of what you earn, right? And maybe when you're 22, you only put away 25 quid a month. But when you're 45 and you've got a really great job, you put away 25% a month because, you're making big bonuses or you've got a great job or whatever. And it's all very personal and horses for courses. But as a broad rule of thumb, if throughout your adult life you can put away 10%, what that means is you're living on 90%. And most people can calibrate their lives so that they can live a really good and enjoyable life on 90% of what they earn. Like, if you actually stop, and one of the things I go back to, which sounds a bit spurious, is if you surveyed 1,000 people this afternoon, like normal people, and said, do you think that Buddhist monks are happy or not? Are monks happy? What do you think the answer would be? Like, from most people, I mean,
I would say yes. I'd say most people would say
yes, right. I mean, I don't know what the percentage would be, but most people would agree that the Dalai Lama is a pretty chill guy and pretty happy, and most people who've chosen the path of being a Buddhist monk are pretty happy. And the reason I make that point is because what do Buddhist monks have economically? Literally nothing. Literally nothing. They have an orange robe and a wooden begging bowl. And in traditional societies, in Buddhist societies, they go and the village gives them a share of their rice so they can live on, and maybe some vegetables and that. And they spend their life in contemplation and meditation, and they have no material things. And there are a fair few other cultures, and particularly in religious things out there in the world, which are aesthetic cultures where they're happy to live on nothing. And the reason I mention that as an extreme example is, if you cut back your life to at or near that, what do I actually need? I need food, shelter, warmth. And that's basically it, right? And I think far too few people are doing that in this day and age. Because if you calibrate, I love books, as you can see over my shoulder. So actually, if you basically make a philosophical decision that you allow yourself to be happy on a very, very simple kind of bread and butter, existence, and it will in modern liberal democracies it will never be that, because actually some really great things that are really enjoyable, like going to the pub with your mates or having a coffee in a coffee shop or watching a great film on free-to-air TV, are wonderful things that are more exciting and nicer than what most of the rest of humanity ever got to do for the last 1,000 years, when life was awful and grindingly poor. And you'd basically work 6 days a week, go to church on Sunday, and if your lord wanted you to go to fight in France in a war, you'd live on turnips and potatoes for a few weeks whilst you marched down to France, have your arm hacked off, and stagger home, and there was no pension and no NHS, right? Look, this is what people... Life is immeasurably better than what it was for most of humanity. And I think if you acknowledge that, calibrate your existence to much less of an... One of the most insidious things about the world we live in is this Instagram nonsense of look at the Gucci handbag I've just bought and look at the expensive holiday. Don't do that, because actually you don't need to do that to be happy. And the evidence from most leading psychologists is that if you do that, you'll be less happy. The likelihood is you'll be less happy. So I think if people take all that stuff on board, it's not hard to calibrate your life so you can live on 90%. And if you do it, you're going to have a much, much better future than if you don't. So why on earth would you not, is kind of my point. Did I cover off all of that question?
No,
I feel like
no. That's my brain goes to a very similar place as far as what is enough. The challenge, I think, is how do you get people away from that instant gratification? I need more. I need the better car. I need the bigger house because my neighbour's got it. In a world where it is Instagram or TikTok, literally, between 10 and 1 minute videos.
I believe, my answer to that is reading. And, so one of the things, the real feature of modernity is, not only are people very financially illiterate and know nothing about financial markets and have these completely limiting and erroneous beliefs about financial markets, in my opinion, based on 25 years of talking to people about such things, very few people are also students of happiness. And and it's very Britons particularly oh, that's cheesy, American self-help. I mean, what are you doing? You're reading a self-help book? I think that's one of the most stupid things about being British. Is all these people self-help? I mean, who reads self? It's okay, let's call it personal development if you want to make it slightly more palatable for an audience. But ultimately, most of the things that most people do now, or an awful lot of people today do things that are already scientifically proven to make them unhappy. Whether that's diet, whether it's their behavior online, arguing with people on social media, like not reading, not learning about nutrition, and it's like, it sounds like a statement of the obvious, but if you want to be happy, let's park finance for a minute. Let's just talk about philosophy and like life, right? If you're a student of, ultimately philosophy is all about how to live a good life and be content and happy, right? Why don't more people read philosophy? It's seen, finance is seen as boring and not for me. Philosophy is seen as boring and not for me. And self-help book or personal finance or personal development books are boring and not for me. And it's like, but you're really unhappy and you're really poor and you're struggling financially. It's like, why don't you put two and two together? And I just think if, millions more people need to be students of financial markets than are at the moment. Like literally tens of millions more people. And we'd be in a much better place. Tens of millions more people would have a better life, and society would be much better. But I actually think at the same time, particularly anybody under the age of about 45, tens of millions of people more need to make a concerted study of actually factually, based on empirical scientific evidence from 30 or 40 years of, people working on this stuff. The things that actually will make you happy and lead a good life and be content are 180 degrees the opposite of what most people are doing. Like Instagramming pictures of the fact that they went to some trendy bar. That does not make you happy. And then there's people like, I think I said to you before you click record, one of the sort of ironies of this modern age is, as a statement of empirical, verifiable fact, more of us are wealthier than at any other time in history. Our material circumstances, there's a certain amount of going backwards compared to our parents. We might have peaked in, say, the 90s, given the inflation adjusted and whatever, and rich people are disproportionately rich. But still, most of us today, in terms of running water, sanitation, warmth, shelter, abundant food, electricity, 99% of human beings who ever lived didn't have electricity. Stop and think about that for the moment. We are about as materially well off. I mean, even a relatively poor person today in the United Kingdom is still richer than 99% of human beings who ever lived in terms of all of this stuff, right? And actually richer than royalty in terms of healthcare and running water and hot showers. The king could not have a hot shower 400 years. The king, right, or an emperor. I mean, it's like, it's crazy. And yet, statistically, we're the most unhappy we've ever been. And rates of mental illness and depression and general anxiety disorder, and all of these things are at all-time highs. And I would contend that that's actually just because people have not enough people are making a concerted study of how to be happy, and when it comes to financial markets, how to be wealthy. So, yeah, without wanting to be horribly patronizing, make a study of both of those things, and then life will get a lot easier and a lot better.
Well, even those people that are the poorest in society still have access to all this information, which is obviously part of the reason why mental health in particular is taking a decline. But they have all this access to this information, but are choosing to consume the wrong ones and are being led down the path by what's social media companies in particular. Not that they are the devil, but they are curating the algorithm for what people want to see, which is unfortunately negativity.
To me though, there's a fairly simple barometer. Like if you find yourself wake up in the morning and you love your life and you're genuinely happy and thrilled about the world and feel like you've got meaning and purpose and everything else, and you're okay financially, you don't need to be very, very rich. You're just okay. You'll be fine today, and you can go to the supermarket and get food and pay for electricity and whatever. Like, if you find yourself basically being pretty happy about your life, you're on the right track. If you're not, if you're grappling with depression and you've got issues and problems, and you need to do some work. Like the answer is the answer is diet, exercise, walks in nature, and learning about philosophy and finance. And that's actually a fairly simple feedback loop of like, am I doing the right thing in my life? It's like, if you're not happy, you're not, and it's your own responsibility to go and sort it out. And as a finance writer, I think the thing that gets missed so much, partly because Britain, to your point, like vilifies wealth creation and we hate city bankers and all this nonsense, is people fail to draw the straight line between financial literacy and being happy. Because actually there's nothing, and I have this all the time from people who've read my book and send me really lovely emails saying how life-changing the information was and all this stuff, and it never gets old. I get emails like that many times a month still now, and it's like, it's the realization that, okay, if I know a little bit about financial markets and economic history and how all this stuff works, life becomes so much easier and less stressful and worrying. Like, almost no matter how much you earn. Obviously, the more you earn, it becomes even easier. But there's nothing worse than somebody who actually gets paid a lot of money and is still stressed about money and finance because they've never learnt about capital markets. That's crazy. That's just insane. And it's crazy that we have a society where that's even possible. But yeah, you only need
there's a correlation.
Conspiracy theory.
Yeah, but there's almost like there's a correlation between financial literacy and becoming wealthy. It's a crazy thought.
Funny, like, correct. Well, it's like the other one. It's like there's a correlation between reading and being happy. Like, it drives me. I've had people approach me wanting a job who've said to me, "Oh, I'm not really much of a reader," and it's like, "Oh my god!" I hate to be honest, or brusque, but that you've just said something that means I will never give you a job.
Yeah.
Never ever say to someone, "I'm not much of a reader," because reading is one of the most, like, it's been around for several hundred years, and it makes your life better. And and I know I've got my cheesy bookshelf over my shoulder there, but and we're far too like permissive of kind of young people who say, "Oh no, I'm not really much to read." Well, then your life's not going to be as good as it would be if you were a reader. Like, seriously.
Yeah.
God, sorry, I've been right.
The best. No, this is my sort of content. No, I genuinely, my brain works the best the more I read. I just think of better ideas. I do read a lot of self-helpy American cheesy kind of stuff in that sense. A lot of it to do with money, but that shapes who you are. I mean, I can't remember the name of the person who said it, but it was you are. In 5 years, you're going to be the accumulation of the people you hang out with and the books you read. And it's so true. It is what you consume and who you talk to is who you're going to become.
100%. And I do think it's but I think a lot of what we've just said is quite obvious. It's like if you understand more stuff and learn more stuff about whether it's nutrition or exercise or just how our brains work when it comes to being happy and content, you're more likely to succeed. I think the finance piece gets missed a lot, though, because it's like if you know enough about finance, the material circumstances of your life are likely to be a lot better, and that story is being told by too few people, because people just don't realize the sheer quantum of it. It's like, because of the power of compounding, if I get 1% better than a mate for 30 years, I'm not going to be like a couple of times richer than them. I'm going to be dozens of times richer than them. And people don't understand this stuff. And the reason I at 5 o'clock this morning I was working on the teenager and young adult version of my first book, because we're desperately keen to get this information in a much more palatable, less inaccessible language than in my first book. Although I like, we're called Plain English Finance for a reason. I like to think my first book is eminently readable. But we just want to make it really accessible for teenagers and young adults, because if you learn this stuff in your teens or 20s, you've got such a good chance of having a better life. Because you only have to take a few simple steps from your 20s onwards to have a much, much better, like 40s, 50s, 60s onwards, right? Like, truly. And the tragedy is that so few people do.
Well, my daughter's 11 now, so I think I'll get her a copy of your book when it comes out. And speaking of reading and books, people need to go and read your first book, How to Own the World, but also subsequent books as well. You've got a great writing style. You helped me immeasurably. You're one of the, I think, first 10 books that I read on personal finance ever. Probably about 4 or 5 years ago. So a lot of probably what you've written and other people have written inspired me to, go out, and I've certainly not touched as many people as your writings have, but my entire goal off the back of learning that information was, oh my God, this stuff isn't actually that complicated, and then trying to translate it to people in a different medium through podcast or, through social media, heaven forbid. And, I've tried to kind of spread the word as well. So people listening now, if you haven't read the book, go and read it.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks a lot. And well, look, I think we were saying before we click record, kind of This interview, I feel like self-conscious actually. I've done a lot of ranting about bad news. I think it's just because of the zeitgeist of the recent budget.
Absolutely,
and
it is.
Whatever else, but
I'm doing the same.
I spend a lot of time actually dwelling on the positive. And I wrote a piece not that long ago called "Pessimists Sound Smart, Optimists Make Money." And actually, there is a lot to be excited about. My most recent book, which is called "Our Future is Biotech," is basically about how the biotech industry is about to do some absolutely amazing things for our species, and it could actually create enough wealth to soak up all this inflation and mean that we're not all going to be eating cat food and impoverished in retirement just because there'll be 20 more $3-5 trillion companies in the future, and that will create massive wealth and life could be good. But
I think innovation. I think the overarching message, certainly that I've got from you today, is that times can be pretty shit, if I'm being completely blunt. Like, it can certainly feel rubbish economically now for a lot of people. But if you do take ownership and learn the simple stuff and start investing over a long period of time, whether it's through low-cost index funds owning the world and, just do that and forget about it and live on less than you make, hey, look, you can become wealthy and this stuff becomes secondary, and primarily you can just live your life and enjoy it.
Yeah, and look, I mean, and if you do a good enough job, it also gives you FU money if you hate your job, and because you like the number of people I've met over the years who said, I followed that and I found myself with actually quite a big pot of capital, and I hated my job, and I just quit my job, and then I got a better job, or I became a YouTuber, or whatever that genuinely had that feedback. So it just gives you all of this stuff. It's not that hard. I go back to the driving analogy, like. I always say learning enough about this stuff to be pretty effective is no harder than learning how to drive a car. It's just this crazy societal blind spot that everyone thinks it's normal to learn how to drive a car, and everyone thinks it's really weird and unusual to learn how to drive your finances. So, and then once you have got enough information, it means it's also not that risky. It's a lot less risky than people think it is, because once you know this stuff, you can take steps that mitigate that risk, and because you know what you're doing. And
really, it's more risky to not do it. Really,
when
you actually weigh it up.
100%, and that's not understood. And it's like, getting it all sorted has a high probability of really changing your life. No matter where you come from, what your background is, what your educational level is, you don't need that much information. As I say, it's no harder than learning to drive a car. I'm labouring that point slightly. And
people need to know.
I've just published, I think it's my 27th sort of 10-12 minute YouTube video on our YouTube channel, Plain English Finance, which is taking people through a step by like all this, the nuts and bolts of this stuff. So despite my rant about reading, if you can't face reading a book about personal finance and you'd rather consume it in bite-sized 10-12 minute videos, then check out our YouTube channel. So a gratuitous plug. Sorry, Brian.
No, I will. I'm going to link everything you've said for your YouTube channel and your books and everything in the description. Andy, look, I've taken a lot of your time today. I really appreciate you coming onto the podcast. I definitely know the people listening are going to get a lot from it. So thank you so much for your time.
No, I really appreciate it, and I'm really self-conscious. This was definitely a bit more of a ranty, negative one. But hopefully, anybody who engages with my stuff will realise that's, it feels a bit like that at the moment. There's a lot to be positive about as well.
Totally, Andy. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.